Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to say thank you to the National Science and Technology Forum for this opportunity to talk about something which has become very topical and which is very dear to my heart, and that is how we receive information and communicate in times of pandemics. I'm Stephanie Burton, I'm from the University of Pretoria, and I'm going to start with the position on where are we right now with respect to the pandemic that is at the moment in our lives. And I think where we need to be is accepting the inevitable. Viruses are here to stay. We've had viruses around a long time, but the most recent news, and this comes from a survey by Nature magazine, shows that most scientists expect the SARS-CoV-2 virus to become endemic. That means it will remain circulating in the human population for as long as we can imagine. But it will become less dangerous, but we can't really predict that. We don't know what the pattern will be. What it means, though, is that the virus is not going to go away next year. And there will be other viral epidemics which will occur in future, and this will be exacerbated with increasing pressure on the environment and biodiversity, and the diseases which we call zoonoses, the ones which transfer from animals to people. Climate change is going to contribute further impact to all of that. The world was not prepared for this pandemic in most ways, but we do need to be prepared for the inevitable future epidemics which we think will be coming our way. So how are we going to address that? Well, there are three key responses which I think we should start with. The first one is that we need to communicate about all of our experience, everything that we do know. Those things. Viruses are almost forever. Everybody needs to understand about viruses and epidemics, and they need to have the necessary information to live safely. The next response is that we need to develop resilience and adaptability. We are going to have to learn how to live differently for a long time. And then the third thing we need is to use the opportunities of our experience for innovation. Development requires innovation, and all of these three responses require information. So the next question is, what information is it that we need? Well, I'm sure everybody in this audience is aware of many questions to which they'd like answers about the virus and what it is and what'll happen to us if we get sick. What is a vaccine? Will it work? Is it dangerous? Which news is correct? The news changes every day. What should we do right now? Who should we believe? And what does the future hold? And what are we going to have to do differently? And how should we be changing our thinking? These are just some of the broad questions. We can start from what we do know, or what we think we know at the moment. We know that the current pandemic has brought a number of major impacts and issues into very sharp focus. And in order to manage the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's a personal, national, or global perspective, we do rely on a constant stream of information. The two graphs at the bottom of this slide are taken from the Johns Hopkins Hospital Research Center, and these are just representative of the kind of data that is available all the time. There's an absolute plethora of dashboards which have appeared globally. They give us information about numbers of people tested, people who have been positive, who's died, and those that have recovered, and so on. All of this is constantly being updated, and it forms the basis for a lot of very important decisions which individuals and governments take. We assume that it's accurate and that it's sufficiently comprehensive to be reliable. None of this data is fully comprehensive, it can't be. But we do assume that we can rely on it. Everything else about the pandemic and the information that comes flooding in seems to be open to interpretation by just about everybody. So, what is the kind of information that we really need? Well, what we need is facts. We need understandable and accurate facts which will allow us to understand what is really happening. We need evidence-based information, which is believable, which allows us to formulate reasonable expectations and to determine what our options are going to be for the future. We also need information which comes from having a greater science culture and awareness and understanding, and we also need information which allows us to trust. I will come back to those two last points later in this presentation. But for now, what we're saying is that we also need to increase educational and awareness programs. We need to provide scientifically sound and accessible information to the general public, accessible to the general public. And in part, we also need to mitigate the infodemic, which I'll say some more about in a moment, which is what erodes public trust. Let me use this example. This is taken directly from an article which Professor Jonathan Jansen wrote recently, just a few days ago, in the media, about vaccine hesitancy as an example. And he says it starts with giving people basic information about vaccines, and that we tend to underestimate just how much that has changed and how much is there, how much information needs to be understood. He also says it's important to be honest about the limitations of vaccines. No vaccine is 100% effective. There might be side effects, but people need to have the clear information. We need to build trust in medicine, and he suggests reminding people that there have been many vaccines before which have allowed us to eliminate a number of very dangerous diseases. And the fourth point that he makes is that we need to demonstrate the safety of having vaccines by recruiting trusted people to take the vaccine in public. These are clear suggestions as to how we might be giving people information. About the same time, just a few days before, colleagues from the University of Stellenbosch published in the Daily Maverick a very similar article saying that vaccine hesitancy comes from a lack of information, that we need that awareness campaign because trust is the key component. And many people have a role to play in that, including South African public figures. But the article goes on to say that people do have genuine concerns and worries, and in order to allay those fears, we need to provide accurate information and clear messaging. A number of people need to do that. Traditional healers, social marketers, public service. We need science journalists on the radio and television and social media, and we need to encourage scientific mindedness, understanding of what the science is around this whole vaccine question. Well, we know all that now, it's very topical, but what more do we need? What other information do we need? There's so much information around at the moment, and anybody who takes a look at any of the newspapers, the print media, the social media, will know that. When we talk about pandemic preparedness, there have been 12 international panels and 14 reports already written about that. I'm going to refer to one which was commissioned by the European Commission in my next couple of slides. But there's also more and more data being presented every day. You will be familiar perhaps with some of these, which are taken from Twitter. They are daily reports on the South African COVID-19 statistics, and you can find them very, very easily on Twitter and on other social media. The point is, people need to know how to access information, and they need to know what to believe and why the information changes. And the information does change all the time. This little chart is one which I put on my own personal Facebook page, thinking that it would be informative for my Facebook friends. But in fact, what happened was that I got a response from one of my friends, a long-standing friend, who looked at that and said, at this stage, who knows what is fact and what is fiction? Well, it took me a little bit by surprise because that friend knows that I'm a scientist. But the point is that science changes as the evidence changes, and you see it all the time. Here's another tweet from a different scientist saying, if the evidence changes, the scientists change their minds. And that's not so difficult to understand. But the key message is that we should be asking the public to listen to the scientists and to trust the experts. Specific information helps, and here's a really good example. The South African Statistics Department has this dashboard, which is the COVID-19 Vulnerability Index. If you take a look at it online, it's active, and it gives you in provinces and in municipalities at that scale the number of people who have different kinds of vulnerabilities, whether it is about access to sanitation or overcrowding or age, medical conditions. This is the kind of information that is very useful to the public as long as they know that it's there. Who needs that information? Well, all sectors of the community need that information. There are individuals who need to have it accessible, communities who maybe need to act on it, the healthcare providers, of course, the World Health Organization, they are both a source of information and a user. Then there's big international organizations and there's policymakers. And for all of them, information has different purposes, needs to be accessible and understandable. Now, I want to talk just for a moment about the communities, because when we look at where we are feeding information, communities are key. And I've taken two quotations from our National Development Plan. I realize that it was from 2012 and it really does need to be perhaps revised. But what it talks about in communities is the fact that this is where we share. We share together work, play, worship, laughter. Our citizens read, write, converse, and value ideas and thoughts. And the line that really strikes me is that I am not self-sufficient alone. We can be self-sufficient as a community. And then I think also we need to think about the rural communities, which are sort of defined in the National Development Plan. The small market towns, the informal settlements, the farm villages, sometimes villages and scattered homesteads. These are areas where communities maybe are not quite so strongly in touch with what is happening in the social media or the print press, for example. So who's going to provide this information to all these people? Well, social media is a big source, and so are the more conventional media. The government, I'll say more about in a moment, but there are also science writers, community leaders, scientists, all of whom should be providing information. And I had said a moment ago, people should listen to the scientists. I think we maybe need to say, where is the voice of the scientific community? We need to have a louder voice and to be more responsive to the questions that people are asking us. We have official channels, of course. We have the government communication strategy, which was produced in early 2020, and we have the government communication and information system, the GCIS. These bits of information are all available online on the parliamentary web pages. But that system, the GCIS, has responsibilities around monitoring and drafting information products, giving media information, photography, videography, websites, and so on. Their strategy involves using infographics, sound bites, video clips, information to be distributed on community radio, activation in malls and taxi ranks, local social media awareness, and training government communicators. All of those are ongoing. In fact, there's quite a lot going on, but I'm not sure how much the public is aware or notices all of that. That journey of communication is published along a number of phases, which go from where we started with announcing this pandemic, through the communications and the regulations and the lockdowns, into managing compliance, and through to having an opportunity for an economic recovery plan. So that is the journey of communication that our GCIS is following, our national strategy. And if you take a look, I won't read you all of this, but there is a snapshot here of all of the activity that our government has been engaged with in terms of communication. The question is, who is seeing it? And is it adequate? And is it accessible? I just want to say a word about what people don't need. They don't need to be confused. People will turn to other sources of information, and that comes with sometimes a lot of gaps, and then there is much opportunity for disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, and so on. And this was also very aptly expressed by Professor Jansen in his article, where he said, in the absence of evidence-based knowledge on vaccines made available to ordinary people, there are any number of wackos, in his words, in the wings, ready and willing to fill that gap with lies, misinformation, and conspiracies. And that is a very dangerous thing. There's also a challenge even from the more academic point of view, because if you ask a different expert to talk about the spread, for example, of the virus, you'll get different answers. A virologist will say, well, this is how it spreads. A modeler will say, well, actually, we need to model how it won't spread. A geneticist will tell you about the lineage and the mutations and so on. A psychologist will tell you how people act. An epidemiologist will say, well, who's going to be affected by it? And the public health experts will say, this is how we need to deal with it. But somebody sitting back and looking at that from their armchair could easily just simply say, you are all wrong. And who's going to argue with that? This was a tweet also. So how must we adapt to all of that? Well, that report that I talked about, the Improving Pandemic Preparedness, points out that public compliance actually depends on trust. It depends on trust in the public authorities, in the messages and the messengers. And that greater trust will lead to more compliance with health measures. And then it also talks about the pandemic of having given rise to this infodemic, this avalanche of information, most of which does tend to create confusion and distrust. The World Health Organization is developing ways of dealing with that in terms of information and trust chains and myth-busting sites. And this is all going to be helpful. But that same report also says, in order to build trust, we need effective risk communication and to tackle that disinformation, misinformation problem, and to strengthen the role of the official sources, the speakers, the messengers who are official. We need to develop communication strategies for advice and policy, which, and these are the things they need to be evidence-based, fit for purpose, flexible and nuanced, and that counter stigmatizing and homogenizing discourses. So this comes from the European Commission and their recommendations for how to prepare for a pandemic. So what do we need to do, improving communication here at home? We need very clear messages from the government. And let me just, again, if I can't say it, who can? We have had some very unclear messages that have come in presentations, in TV broadcasts. In fact, a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday evening, we had on one news program, one of our experts, Professor Slim Karim, speaking about vaccines and how they should be rolled out. And at the same time, exactly, on the national news broadcast, two other experts giving a very long and complicated presentation, which the minister himself agreed was complicated and perhaps confusing. I would like to say I don't think that was helpful to the public at all. We need clear messages. We need regular professional communication, including the media, to build that trust. And that will enable the government to implement their policies. And there will be benefits to be derived. But it needs to be clear. The science journalists have a key role to play in ensuring that they are well informed and that they write clearly and correctly and accurately and explain when things change. And as I said earlier, the scientists need to speak out more. There's much can be said about that, but broadly, information needs to be accessible everywhere, and that information will guide how people adapt. How do we send it out? Well, in different forms for different communities. Pamphlets and packaging and leaflets are not obsolete, they're very useful, and billboards, outdoor advertising and notice boards. Every small shop, when you go into the rural areas, has a television or a TV screen or a computer screen on the wall. Those can be used for messaging as well. There are many different ways in which we can be using media, and all of them should be part of what we do to provide information which should be accessible, simple, understandable, and in some cases in the appropriate language, so that people do get the information that they need. And then I just want to talk a little about the opportunities that we have. We have many opportunities for innovative communication. Science is changing, it's based on data and data-intensive systems. We have technologies which link the virtual with the real and the biological worlds. We have artificial intelligences which are helping us develop new knowledge. We have the move to open science so that the public has access to and is aware of all the information that we have, our research and our data. I'll say a word about data management in a moment. We have a move to inclusivity and co-creation. We need to be talking with our communities and with our government role players. And science engagement, all of this, involves conversations. Scientists have opinions as well as responsibilities, and people are interested in those opinions. How do we do that? We need to have inclusive conversations. This diagram simply indicates some of the ways in which we can have inclusive conversations which will bring information with impact to our communities and our stakeholders and the government role players and the public role players. I want to just say, though, that managing data and information needs to be done responsibly. We have many ways to manage data, and there's an enormous amount of it. We can have repositories, we can use artificial intelligences, we can discover much from data. What's important is that we ensure that it's visible and that we make it discoverable. That brings with it the burden, perhaps the responsibility of research integrity. Much is being said about research integrity at the moment. And that is also about what the public expect and what the public want to trust. They want to know that there's value in the research that's being done and that there is truth and ethical use in the data. That data actually belongs to the public. And of course, cybersecurity is an aspect of all of that. So all of that leads to building a science culture through the whole community in our country. We have community linkages, we have education, we have influences. And through that we can build a science culture which will involve cultural practices. We need to discuss religious and traditional practices. Where does traditional medicine fit in? Where does the science, maths and science education come from? And the social and other media, and the role of the scientists. Put all that together into a system and we can build a science culture. This is a lot of words which I'm not going to read to you, but what we really mean is that we need to have values and skills which the whole community value, so that they can take the developments that science produces and enable everybody to be a part of those discussions and to understand their meaning and their value. This article is one which obviously you can look up, but it has a great deal about how we build a science culture and a science awareness through our whole country. And finally, I want to say there are other key related issues which we should also be communicating about. There's the immediate politics, there's the vaccine nationalism, as it's called, and this is a tweet from Dr. Tedros, who you all will know, is one of our international experts from the World Health Organization, saying we need vaccine equity, we need fairness, and if we don't all have access to the vaccine, then we will none of us be safe. And at the moment, if you take a look at Africa in that little map, there is no data for the vaccinations that are taking place in Africa. We know that in our country we have more than 10,000 people already vaccinated today, but we do need the information and we need that equity. Then there are other key issues which are really important that we continue to communicate about education and the digital divide, about mental health during this pandemic and future epidemics, about discrimination and equity through the society, and about climate change and the fact that this is a huge planetary crisis. It's not going to wait, and it will have a massive impact on any future epidemics. There are lots of global development agendas in the long term. In fact, if we had managed to achieve more towards the Sustainable Development Goals, we'd be in a better place to deal with COVID-19. But they are still a framework which we should be talking about, and the southern agendas around that are largely about things like population growth and connectedness and communication. So that is also still very relevant, and we should still be talking about it. There are many global trends which are also important, particularly the resource-constrained world, which has got a lot worse in the last few years, the economy and demographics and urbanization and the youth bulge in the south, the world becoming flat in terms of ICT and knowledge availability, and then education also becoming more open, more online, and more ICT-based. These are big trends which everybody needs to be aware of and understand the implications for. And my last message is this one. The most important message of all right now is that this comes also from Dr. Tedros and Michael Bloomberg in a very recent article in Bloomberg, which says stopping the next pandemic starts now. The next global health crisis is on its way, and we need to prepare. The list of bullets on the left-hand side of this slide say what is in that article, and I strongly recommend it. They are saying we need more of everything that we are doing. More research, surveillance, data, vaccine platforms, coordination, more community engagement, more communication, and more primary health care. And then just to finalize it, Dr. Tom Frieden, who is also a very active medical expert who also is very active in Twitter, saying if we don't start preparing now for the next pandemic, we will be caught off guard. Fixing primary health care and reducing non-communicable disease are two important steps. I would like to emphasize that one about more community engagement and more communication. Thank you. And I'd like to just acknowledge two of my collaborators, Dr. Letty Klein and Professor Michael Pepper, who contributed to the content of this talk. Thank you for your attention.